They call it the end of the line. Prisons so secure that escape isn't just impossible, it's mathematically close to zero. Where the most dangerous men in America disappear behind steel, concrete, and silence. But beyond ADX Florence, there's a hidden network of ultra-secure prisons. Facilities the public barely hears about, each with stories darker than the last. Today we're going inside them. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by real-life crime, prison history, and the hidden world of America's toughest correctional facilities, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel brings you fact-checked, research-driven documentaries from inside the most feared institutions on Earth. Your support helps us uncover stories that most media never touch. Now, take a deep breath. Because where we're going next, light barely reaches. In the high desert of Colorado, surrounded by sun-bleached plains and miles of emptiness, sits a prison built to extinguish the idea of escape itself. Officially named the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, known worldwide as ADX Florence, it remains America's most famous Supermax. Yet few understand what it really represents. The federal government's last line of control over men deemed too violent, too radical, or too unpredictable for any other institution. Completed in 1994, ADX was born out of blood. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, federal prisons across the country faced a surge of violence, brutal stabbings, staff killings, hostage situations. Multiple officers had been murdered in the line of duty. Federal leadership believed that only a new type of facility, 100% focused on containment, could stop the escalating chaos. That belief created what some experts describe as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Everything at ADX is engineered for one purpose: to control every second of an inmate's life. The cells are poured concrete. The bed, desk, and stool are part of the floor. The unbreakable window is so narrow it resembles a vertical mail slot, angled toward the sky to eliminate sight lines, preventing inmates from knowing their exact location. Even sunlight arrives filtered and weakened. For most prisoners inside the infamous control unit, life takes place in a 7 by 12-foot concrete box for 22 to 23 hours a day. Meals slide through a steel slot. The shower is automated. When recreation arrives, it's inside a concrete cage that resembles a giant empty kennel. Some inmates call it the box inside the box. Over the years, men who shaped the front pages of American history have been held here. Terrorists from the 1993 World Trade Center plot. High-ranking cartel members. Violent gang leaders. Domestic extremists. People whose names became symbols of fear or controversy. But the public rarely hears what becomes of them after trial and sentencing. The silence isn't accidental. ADX operates under a system known as no-contact confinement. Officially, this structure exists to protect staff and other inmates from high-risk prisoners. Unofficially, critics argue it's designed to erase influence, isolating leaders who could organize inside other prisons or communicate with criminal networks outside. Every movement is calculated. Every interaction is risk-managed. Every sound echoes through concrete corridors that were designed to absorb chaos before it can spread. But even inside this escape-proof fortress, there have been moments that forced the nation to re-examine its assumptions about absolute control. Lawsuits from former staff. Mental health warnings from human rights investigators. Stories from inmates describing sensory deprivation so intense it blurred the line between punishment and psychological collapse. Some described losing their sense of time entirely. Others reported that even the silence felt weaponized. To understand why ADX exists, you must understand what came before it, and what came after. Because ADX isn't the only fortress of fear in the American system. It is simply the most legendary. Beyond its razor wire, the United States quietly maintains an even deeper network of ultra-secure prisons, places where danger, secrecy, and history collide. Some are older than ADX, some more violent, and some hidden behind state administrative systems rather than federal headlines. And those prisons tell stories unlike anything you've heard yet. As we leave the Colorado desert behind and cross state lines into new territories of confinement, we step into a world where survival is a daily negotiation, where authority is constantly challenged, and where every locked door has a story carved into it, written in blood, fear, and silence. What lies beyond ADX Florence is not just a list of prisons. It is a map of America's deepest fears. And our next destination is a place where the word Supermax was born long before the government made it official. Long before ADX Florence became the symbol of absolute control, there was another prison. One that quietly shaped the future of American corrections. In the isolated farmland of southern Illinois stands a fortress built in 1963, USP Marion. At first glance, it seemed like just another high-security penitentiary. But history had a different plan for it. In the decades that followed, Marion would become the testing ground for a new philosophy of incarceration, one that would eventually evolve into the modern Supermax system. Marion was intended to replace the iconic Alcatraz, which closed the same year. The idea was simple. If Alcatraz had been America's hardest prison, Marion would be even tougher, even more controlled, even more secure. But no one anticipated how quickly the pressure inside would build, or how dramatically the institution would change the entire system. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Marion had become a battleground. Powerful prison gangs rose to prominence inside its walls, including factions of the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia. Tensions escalated as these groups fought for influence, smuggling routes, and control of cell blocks. Staff walked the corridors knowing every step could be their last. Inmates navigated alliances and betrayals in a violent underground economy. Every day felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. Everything changed on October 22, 1983. In the span of just a few hours, two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were stabbed to death in separate, coordinated attacks carried out by inmates affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood. The murders shook the nation and exposed how dangerous Marion had become. For the Federal Bureau of Prisons, it was a turning point. Within days, the warden made a decision that would alter the philosophy of incarceration across America. Marion went into a permanent lockdown. Not temporary. Not until further notice. Permanent. This had never happened before in a federal prison. From that moment forward, Marion became the prototype for control unit housing, where inmates were isolated 22 to 23 hours a day, movement was restricted, privileges were limited, and communication was tightly controlled. It was the first experiment in what policymakers would soon label Supermax confinement. 4 years, Marion inmates lived under the strictest regime in the United States. Every door operated electronically. Every step was monitored. Every sound carried an unspoken tension. Reports from the era describe a place where silence felt unnatural, where the clang of a cell door echoed like a gunshot, and where a wrong move could mean immediate discipline. The government argued the lockdown saved lives. Critics argued it damaged minds. But regardless of opinion, the Marion model spread. States across the country studied it, copied it, and eventually built their own Supermax units. Facilities designed to contain men who had become too dangerous even for maximum security prisons. Even after ADX Florence opened in 1994, many inmates who paved the path towards Supermax confinement remained legendary within Marion's history. Violent gang leaders. Radical extremists. Men whose influence extended far beyond the prison walls. Marion became synonymous with absolute control and the battle to contain the uncontrollable. But beneath that harsh reputation lies another truth. Marion never truly escaped its own legacy. Former staff have described the emotional toll of working long-term inside such a tense environment. Former inmates have spoken about the psychological impact of total isolation. And researchers often point to Marion as the beginning of a national debate that still continues today. How far should a prison go to keep the system safe? Yet even with its hard-earned reputation, Marion is only the first stop on our journey beyond ADX. Because as strict as Marion became, other prisons would soon emerge with histories even bloodier, environments even more volatile, and secrets even more chilling. America has supermaxes hidden in plain sight, places where violence erupts even under the tightest security, where gangs operate with military-level structure, where guards walk into work knowing they might not walk out the same. Our next destination is one of those places. A prison buried deep in the heart of the desert. A place where silence and heat mix into something far more dangerous than solitude. The desert has always been a place where the harshest conditions shape the strongest, or the most desperate. In Arizona, where temperatures climb above 110 degrees and the land stretches out in endless waves of dust and silence, the state built a cluster of high-security prisons designed not just to isolate, but to break the cycle of violence that had plagued the region for decades. At the center of this transformation stands a facility whose history is written with escape attempts, riots, and political scandal, the Arizona State Prison Kingman Complex. Though not a single building, Kingman represents a category of ultra-secure environments that emerged across Arizona during the 1990s and 2000s. If ADX Florence is a fortress of silence and Marion is the birthplace of the lockdown era, Arizona's desert prisons became something else entirely: pressure cookers, where extreme climate, overcrowding, and powerful gang structures collided. Arizona's Department of Corrections faced a unique challenge. The state had some of the fastest-growing prison populations in the nation. Methamphetamine trafficking, border-related crimes, and a surge of violent gang activity fueled an imprisonment boom. Facilities filled faster than they could be built, and tensions between inmate groups became explosive. Correctional officers were pushed to their limits. Policies tightened. Tempers boiled. But nothing exposed the system's vulnerabilities more than the notorious 2010 escape from Kingman. On a sweltering July night, 3 inmates, Tracy Province, Daniel Renwick, and John McCluskey, managed to cut through perimeter fencing using simple tools. They slipped past guard towers, avoided detection, and disappeared into the darkness of the Mojave Desert. The incident shocked the nation, because escapes from high-security desert facilities were supposed to be impossible. But this was no Hollywood plot. It was a chain reaction of human error, equipment failures, and systemic cracks. The fugitives' escape triggered a 2-week manhunt across multiple states. By the time the trio was captured, their flight had been linked to the murder of an elderly couple in New Mexico. The tragedy forced Arizona lawmakers to confront serious flaws in security and oversight, especially since Kingman was partially operated by a private corporation. The fallout reshaped the state's approach to high-security management and fueled national conversations about the privatization of prisons. But the escape wasn't the only dark chapter in Arizona's Supermax-style institutions. Inside these desert fortresses, powerful gangs such as the Arizona Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, and the New Mexican Syndicate cultivated influence with military-like precision. Inmates communicated through coded messages, tattoos, and discreet hand signals. Contraband flowed strictly through human channels. Corrupt staff manipulated visitors and improvised tools. Turf wars erupted over drug lines and racial boundaries. Even under restricted housing, violence could spike without warning. The desert itself added another layer of brutality. Cells absorbed heat until metal fixtures burned to the touch. Water shortages created tension. Medical care struggled to keep up with chronic dehydration cases. Officers often patrolled under blazing sun for hours, their vests baking against their bodies. The environment punished everyone, not just the incarcerated. But the true measure of an ultra-secure prison isn't just how terrifying it is, it's how much it reveals about the system that created it. And Arizona's desert supermaxes revealed a truth the nation often overlooks. Security alone cannot stop violence. You can pour concrete, build fences, and fortify towers, but human desperation always finds a crack. Following the Kingman escape and a series of riots, including a 2015 disturbance that injured several officers, the state tightened oversight and restructured multiple units. Kingman's management contract changed hands. Surveillance expanded. More resources were devoted to intelligence gathering on gang networks. But the psychological scars of those years continued to shape the institution. Arizona's high-security prisons stand today as modern fortresses, proof that danger evolves, adapting to heat, isolation, and desperation. They are reminders that America's toughest prisons aren't always the ones with the biggest walls, but the ones where the environment itself becomes the enemy. And yet, the desert is just one landscape of America's ultra-secure world. Our next destination is colder, older, and haunted by decades of bloodshed. A place where power struggles, racial conflicts, and gang wars once turned a prison yard into a battlefield. On the far northern edge of California, where mist rolls in from the Pacific and the trees stand tall like ancient sentinels, sits one of America's most feared prisons, Pelican Bay State Prison. Hidden among pine forests and constant fog, it was designed to contain the most violent, influential, and unpredictable inmates in the state, men whose actions shaped the criminal landscape of the entire West Coast. Opened in 1989, Pelican Bay became California's answer to an escalating crisis of gang warfare. By the late 1980s, the state's prison population had exploded, and the power of organized prison gangs, especially the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family, was growing at a pace the system could no longer control. Violence surged. Murders inside facilities became alarmingly common. Officers were ambushed. Gang leaders continued orchestrating criminal operations on the streets. California needed a place that could isolate the most powerful individuals in its system. A place designed not for rehabilitation but for containment. Pelican Bay became that place. Its most infamous section, the Security Housing Unit, better known as the SHU, was engineered to eliminate gang communication. Inmates housed in the SHU lived in windowless, sound-reducing concrete cells for 22 to 24 hours per day. Doors were solid metal. Yards were small and fully enclosed, often referred to as dog runs. Contact with other humans was rare and controlled. Every detail was crafted to dismantle gang structures that thrived on communication and hierarchy. But Pelican Bay's story is not just about security, it's about the tension between control and survival. Inside the mainline yards, racial and gang-based divisions shaped the social structure. Every step, every glance, every conversation carried weight. Fighting was not always spontaneous. Sometimes it was strategic, directed by shot callers who enforced discipline through intimidation or violence. A simple dispute over a seat in the chow hall could escalate into a riot if it violated the unwritten laws of the yard. Officers walked the facility with constant vigilance. Many had seen colleagues seriously injured in surprise attacks. Others remembered riots that erupted with frightening speed. Pelican Bay became known for its unpredictability, its volatility, and the way multiple gang networks used it as a proving ground for young members. The prison's isolation also fueled controversy. In the early 1990s, reports surfaced of excessive force, abuse, and psychological deterioration caused by long-term solitary confinement. Investigations followed. Attorneys, activists, and mental health experts raised concerns about inmates spending 10, 15, or even 20 years in the SHU. In 1995, a federal court ruled that Pelican Bay's conditions violated the Eighth Amendment for mentally ill prisoners. Yet for gang investigators, the SHU was essential. It disrupted leadership structures and restricted kites, the tiny written messages used to send orders. It reduced murders in other prisons. It curtailed extortion rackets and drug distribution. Law enforcement credited Pelican Bay with pushing back the influence of major prison gangs whose reach extended far beyond the walls. But even the most secure systems faced pressure. By the early 2010s, the SHU became the focal point of one of the largest prisoner-led protests in U.S. history. Thousands of inmates across California participated in hunger strikes demanding an end to indefinite solitary confinement and gang validation, procedures that kept inmates in the SHU for decades based on tattoos, artwork, or confidential information. The strikes forced the state to re-evaluate its policies, leading to a historic settlement in 2015 that dramatically reduced the number of inmates housed in Pelican Bay's SHU. For the first time in decades, some prisoners stepped into open air, sunlight, and social yards after years of isolation. The prison's population shifted. Control strategies evolved. But the legends of Pelican Bay, the riots, the controversies, the power struggles, remained deeply rooted in the institution's identity. Pelican Bay stands today as a symbol of both the extremes of prison control and the fierce debates around human rights in high-security confinement. It represents the evolving battle between security and humanity, between gang influence and institutional order. But our journey doesn't end in the forests of California. Because deeper in the American prison network lies a facility so notorious, so violent, and so historically transformative that it redefined the concept of maximum security for an entire generation. A place where inmate wars became national headlines, where uprisings shook the nation, and where the deadliest prison riot in U.S. history erupted. Before the Ohio State Penitentiary became one of the most secure facilities in the Midwest, another prison cast a long and violent shadow over the state's correctional system. That place was Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, better known by one name, Lucasville. It was here, in 1993, that one of the deadliest prison uprisings in American history exploded, an event so violent, so chaotic, and so misunderstood that it changed Ohio forever. To understand the modern Ohio State Penitentiary, OSP, the Supermax where Ohio houses its most dangerous inmates, you must first return to the dusty, chaotic yards of Lucasville, where the system collapsed under its own pressure. In the early 1990s, Lucasville was a powder keg. Housing more than 1,800 inmates, many of them affiliated with powerful gangs, the facility struggled with overcrowding, understaffing, racial tension, and a deteriorating infrastructure. The Aryan Brotherhood, the gangster disciples, and the Muslims had carved out their own territories. Every hallway had unwritten rules. Every yard had invisible borders. Step across one without permission and you could lose your life. Yet despite the volatility, Lucasville's administration introduced new policies that inflamed tensions. One policy in particular, mandatory tuberculosis testing that involved an injection containing phenol, sparked outrage among Muslim inmates who objected on religious grounds. Instead of negotiation, the prison leadership insisted on compliance. The decision would ignite one of the most intense standoffs in U.S. prison history. On Easter Sunday, April 11, 1993, chaos erupted. What began as a protest quickly spiraled into a full-scale riot. Inmates seized control of an entire cell block, taking several guards hostage. Gang members who normally stood on opposite sides of racial and ideological battle lines suddenly formed an unusual alliance, not out of friendship, but out of a shared desire to challenge the administration's perceived disrespect and abuses. For 11 days, Lucasville descended into a nightmare. Smoke-filled corridors. Makeshift barricades rose from steel and debris. Hostages were paraded before negotiators in tense standoffs. Rival groups turned on one another as distrust boiled beneath the temporary alliance. Communication from inside became cryptic, frantic, and filled with demands. Outside, families of correctional officers waited helplessly as news anchors broadcast the crisis nationwide. When the uprising finally ended, the toll was staggering. 9 inmates were killed, some brutally executed by rival factions who used the chaos to settle old scores. One corrections officer, Robert Vallandigham, was murdered during the standoff. His death shook the state to its core and ensured that the repercussions would echo for decades. The public demanded consequences. The government demanded control. And the Ohio prison system responded with a solution that would reshape incarceration in the state forever. That solution was the Ohio State Penitentiary, opened in 1998. Built on a high ridge overlooking Youngstown, OSP was designed as a modern Supermax, a facility that combined advanced surveillance, controlled movement and multi-layered security specifically to prevent another Lucasville from ever happening again. The architects studied ADX Florence and Marion. They incorporated lessons from decades of riots, uprisings and gang wars. Every hall, every door, every cell represented a lesson learned in blood. OSP became the new home for some of the key figures involved in the Lucasville uprising. These men were placed in the most restrictive housing units, monitored nearly every minute, and separated from each other to prevent communication. The state believed this would dismantle the lingering influence of groups that had coordinated the rebellion. But the legacy of Lucasville didn't disappear, it transformed. Lawyers, activists, and researchers began examining the uprising in greater depth. Some questioned the state's narrative. Others argued that the alliances formed during the riot, even among bitter enemies, represented a complex political struggle rather than simple chaos. Over the years, scholars studied the event to understand why such an explosive alliance emerged in the first place. Inside OSP, inmates adjusted to the new reality. Conditions were stricter than any Ohio facility before it. Movement was controlled to the second. Isolation mirrored the design of Pelican Bay and Marion. For those placed in the highest security tier, life was defined by steel doors, automated systems, and minimal human interaction. Yet OSP's birth, even more than its design, symbolized something important. The United States was entering an era where every major riot, escape, or violent incident spawned new layers of security and new interpretations of what maximum control should look like. Lucasville left a scar that can still be felt today. It shaped the policies of an entire state. It reshaped the national conversation about prison uprisings. And it demonstrated, tragically, that when pressure builds inside a system without release, violence becomes inevitable. But our journey isn't stopping in Ohio. Because deeper in the South lies a prison so infamous, so steeped in violence and history, that its name alone sends a shiver through generations. A place built on a former slave plantation. A place where punishment, power, and brutality formed a deadly legacy. In the end, America's most secure prisons are more than concrete, steel, and razor wire. They are mirrors, reflecting the darkest chapters of violence, control, and human desperation. From the cold walls of ADX Florence to the blood-soaked legacy of Lucasville, from Pelican Bay's shadowed corridors to the blistering desert fortresses of Arizona, each institution carries a story carved by the men who lived there, the officers who guarded them, and the system that shaped them. These places weren't built out of cruelty. They were built out of fear. Fear of chaos, fear of uprising, fear of what happens when violence spills into the world beyond those walls. But inside every fortress, one truth remains. No amount of concrete can fully contain the complexities of human behavior. Power shifts, alliances form, desperation grows, and sometimes even the most secure environment can erupt with a single mistake. As the years pass, new prisons rise, old ones transform, and policies evolve, but the questions remain. How much control is necessary? How much isolation is too much? And what does justice look like inside a world built to extinguish hope? the stories don't end here. They live in court records, in news archives, in surviving witnesses, and in the memories of those who walked these corridors and lived to tell what they saw. And as long as these prisons stand, their histories will continue to shape the future of American corrections. If this journey through America's darkest, most fortified institutions opened your eyes to a world few ever see, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more stories to uncover, stories that deserve to be told, stories that define the hidden world behind the bars. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, behind every locked door, there is a story waiting in the silence.